Oh, no worries. Cool. I'm Alek, founder of Settle. So we're a cash flow management platform for brands, mostly helping them with their payments, financing, and just generally helping them reduce their cash conversion cycles. But I have two guests, Brian and Suze. So how about you guys introduce yourselves and tell us about your company?
I can start. Hi, everyone. I'm Suze Dowling. I'm co-founder and chief business officer of Pattern Brands. So we are a family of brands that's owned and operated by one team under one virtual roof that's really focused on acquiring digitally native brands that are in the home goods space. So for us, it's really about enjoying daily life at home and how can you make those like micro moments in your day just a little bit better. So we have 4 publicly announced brands in the family, a couple that we haven't yet announced, with products ranging from kitchen utensils, dining, home organization. Really our goal is to fill out every room of your home. We are very D2C first, but have been really expanding omni-channel in the last year or so. So have presence now Amazon, wholesale, and most recently actually a brick and mortar location as well. So it's been a bit of an adventure, that is for sure.
I'm Brian Bordainick, one of the co-founders of Starface. We have a second company called Plus, and similarly have 3 other businesses launching over the next year or so. Starface, our sort of most established company, is focused on kind of trying to make acne cool and culturally relevant, and we really try to focus on categories that have a high degree of stigma or shame and try to make something that's really interesting and kind of flipping those conversations on its head. We're also big believers in digital first, though we really try to take the fight to where customers are. So we launched Starface in 2018 and pretty quickly moved into a retail sort of setup in both the US, UK, and Canada, which was both awesome from a growth perspective, but presented a lot of challenges for us as it related to the supply chain and COVID and all of that.
Cool. Yeah, thanks for coming. So when you kind of think about pre-pandemic and now, have your strategies changed? And if so, how so?
So, I mean, ours definitely has. So we started out pre-pandemic incubating our own brands. So we previously ran a brand and marketing agency called Gin Lane and had closed that down about a year prior to the pandemic and really said, okay, we're incubating brands now. This is what we're doing. We launched 2 with the second launching a month before kind of New York was shut down. And that was, a reality check. It was a great time to be selling homewares, but it also really made us think about our incubation strategy. And so, we were really just honestly networking with a bunch of other entrepreneurs and kind of hearing about how they were surviving the pandemic. And organically, we also really then were hearing about their challenges in scaling their businesses. I think, something we really noticed was that it's easier than ever to launch a brand these days. I think you've got Shopify, you've got a lot of SaaS platforms that can really support that. But once you hit a certain point of scale, things become much more operationally complex. And then throw COVID and what happened in the supply chain environment in the mix, I think it really was just even more complex. And what we realized was there was actually a bigger opportunity for our business to go into acquiring brands. So I'd say, without COVID, would we have moved into acquiring brands? Quite frankly, maybe not. And now that is really our business strategy of how we approach growth. And, it's been interesting, I think, to learn how to acquire a brand now in a digitally first environment, but also in a remote first environment as a team.
Yeah. We really only know the COVID sort of landscape and atmosphere. So, we launched our first company, Starface, in September of 2019. So we only really know this sort of existence. I feel terrible for our operations people because they sort of came of age dealing with the most unique and challenging circumstances, but in a lot of ways, I think that experience will serve them well, certainly with us, but anywhere that they go in their career. I sort of brought my own baggage to the table, as we all do, when we were launching Starface, and we had a very crazy idea in 2018-19, which was that the internet was going to continue to get more expensive and it would be harder to stand out there. So our strategy from the jump was really to create content that could be shared. Even though we consider ourselves a digital first brand, if you look at where the predominant amount of our revenue comes from, it comes from retail. And that was like a pretty wild thought. I think at the time we had investors, potential investors, current investors who, when we originally launched Starface with Target in the US, people were telling us that we were making a huge mistake because Glossier and Everlane and Allbirds, well, they never launched in big box retail, and cool brands don't do that. We were kind of like, well,
yes, they do.
Don't care. And as a result, we've developed really strong kind of partnerships and relationships that have served us really, really well. So our strategy, I think, like we sort of saw directionally where things were going to go. Also because we focus on a Gen Z customer, Gen Alpha, Gen Z. I watched over the first couple months of the brand, the entire ecosystem on Instagram completely collapse. So it wasn't like rocket science where it's like, where the hell are these young kids? And they all moved from Instagram to TikTok. So I think we were one of the first brands in the US to go onto TikTok. And it wasn't because we're like these deep, innovative thinkers. We're just like, where the hell are all the kids? And we were doing creator houses in Los Angeles before the pandemic happened. And you can imagine how strange that was because the platform was new, the creators were new. But that was always sort of our strategy, was just to follow the young people wherever they were going. And I think what we learned very, very early on was that young people, like not millennials, but like young people today, I think they want to buy the product everywhere that they are. So they're occasionally rolling into a CVS or they're going to they want to see it on Amazon, or occasionally they're going to want to go to your website. And I think we were pretty early, dipping our toe into the water that this was going to be the future. And then as the pandemic happened, iOS 14 happened, we were like, oh, maybe we're onto something here. So it's like more of an evolution of our strategy, mostly getting lucky, I would say.
Over the past 2 years, have you seen your supply chain evolve, and like what challenges do you currently see?
We have seen our supply chain evolve. I mean, things that we would have never thought to do 3 years ago are starting to make a little bit more sense. So like domestic manufacturing, what is something that would have been like, get out of here, we can't even consider this. But when you take the challenges not only with air, but with freight and ocean and dry dockage and like all this stuff, you're like, this may just be easier and potentially even more cost effective for us to do this. And I think one of the things that we certainly had to do, which was bizarre for a company that was not very big at the time, was duplicate and triplicate our supply chain, which is something that you do when you're at like 100, 200 million or something like that. I mean, we had to do it from very early on because we manufacture a product that's very similar to bandage, which is very similar to PPE. So we had factories getting taken over by local governments and just complete chaos in our supply chain. We had that plus a pretty severe overperformance at retail, which sounds fun on a panel like this, but creates extreme havoc in the back end. So, we were, I think, projecting to do a few $1 million at retail. We wound up doing 4 times that and just chasing and chasing and chasing. So it was a bit of a scramble to kind of get things set up. And now I think it has become more of like the backbone of the business to just be like, oh, we want to make a new product. You're like, cool, find 3 places that can make it and make sure you own the formulas, then you can be able to tech transfer and things like that.
Yeah, it's been interesting for us. I think 2020 was so unprecedented, and we also had some random products that were involved in PPE, and that we make stuff with felt. And so felt was impossible to get our hands on, and then the prices were skyrocketing there. I think we saw in 2021 that it was challenging, and certainly in 2022, I'd say challenging but manageable. Like, it feels like things are settling, and certainly we're able to be more proactive versus reactive in our approach. I think for us, it's really been about making sure we're focusing on our inventory planning, because the more brands we add, the more SKUs we're adding, and so we now have thousands of SKUs, and we're taking over, established supply chains, and also then really trying to make sure that we're optimizing those supply chains. So for us, it's certainly been about secondary sourcing, raw material availability, how we can kind of leverage the power of multiple brands from a negotiation standpoint with suppliers. But really, I mean, at the moment, we're buying into 2023 inventory positions, which means that, I mean, that's significant capital outlay, and it's really meant that really focusing on that working capital side of things has become increasingly important. And again, imagine this, each time you add a brand, you're also adding inventory and kind of capital needs.
Both of you are, managing multiple brands and a few more on the way. Are you starting to see those like economies of scale by being able to group things together, or not so much yet?
Yes and no. I'd say some things, multiple of our brands use silicon as a raw material, so that's something that we have been able to kind of leverage negotiating power there, and also, quite frankly, bid the suppliers off against each other because, they each want each other's business. I think the biggest areas we've really seen, some of that come to life are really on our inbound. So we really are very focused on how we optimize our inbound shipments and our containers. And given that the majority of our manufacturing is in southern China, we're able to kind of have multi-brand containers that we are, really optimizing there. And then our 3PL relationships. I think while everyone does focus on the complexities of the international supply chain, domestically things have been more tough. I can't tell you how many rate increases we've had at our 3PL, the UPS fees, the FedEx fees being jacked up each year. And so now having multiple 3PL relationships, we're able to use the volume of portfolio scale to apply those optimized rates at the individual brand level.
Unfortunately for us, certainly yes on like a 3PL and some of those bigger kind of like freight relationships, but from a manufacturing standpoint, unfortunately everything that we do is a completely different category. We really focus on try to focus on stigma, shame categories, places where we think we can own a digital narrative and create something relevant and cool, which doesn't always lend itself to.
Do your products have expiry dates as well?
We do.
God bless you.
We do, but they're pretty long. So we're able, we have 2-year expiry dates on almost everything that we make, which is relatively helpful. But from a manufacturer standpoint, it is a little bit more institutional muscle than it is being able, for us anyway, to leverage certain relationships.
Brian, you've talked about diversifying supply chain mostly out of need, but with the geopolitical risk with China, do you guys kind of consider hey, we might need a backup from that perspective? I
mean, it's funny, we started diversifying our supply chain. Everyone forgets about this, but when Trump was in office, there were those tariffs in China, and that was what we were trying to. It sounds almost comical at this point, but we were trying to avoid a 5% tariff. And we're trying to figure out how do we find somewhere else to make these products. I think as the company continues to mature and our businesses continue to mature, I feel like I am spending a lot more of my own sort of time and mental energy thinking about macroeconomic trends and political instability and things of that nature, more so than I certainly ever thought I would. I think for us, having that backup option and making sure that we have multiple briefs, just because the world is such a dynamic place. I mean, we all live through something that is our children and our children's children will certainly ask us about, but we're so immediately either on the heels of it. It's hard to really grasp, I think, how this has impacted us. So, just having those options to be okay, if the shit really hits the fan over here, we kind of have somewhere to go, but I think about it more from a pandemic, from a political, from a tax or something like that, almost every single angle.
I mean, we definitely are thinking about that too. I think for us, we definitely view a risk of having so much of our production concentrated in southern China. We've definitely started having secondary sources outside of China, and I think we'll be continuing to evaluate that strategy. For certain products, we are moving manufacturing to the U.S. As that's just making more sense these days. I never thought I'd think about currency fluctuations so much in my life. That's an area that for us, we're really very focused on, because it can make a pretty significant impact in cost.
Outside of cost and obviously time of shipment and whatnot, do you see any differences between the U.S. manufacturing, overseas manufacturing, can you like iterate quicker? And how do you kind of look at quality of goods?
I don't know. For me, I think the U.S. certainly doesn't have the same infrastructure set up that China, does have. For us, it's really been about thinking what products make the most sense to manufacture overseas versus what items may make sense to manufacture here. For us, we've taken over a business that sells candles and other apothecary, including incense, et cetera. And so that's an area that we're really focused on maintaining U.S. production. It gives us a lot more flexibility to be really nimble and agile in how we respond there. I think for some of the items in our home organization line, that really is China is where it makes most sense to maintain that production.
Yeah, I think like it's certainly not true across the board, but like I think some of maybe the legacy thought that we have around certain places making inferior product. I don't, at least in our categories, I don't know how true those things kind of like necessarily hold up. Again, just speaking about our categories, like some of the places that we work with are doing such volume and have been doing it for so long that they really are really fantastic at making skincare products or whatever their particular specialty is.
I feel like it's just about picking and being really careful with the supplier that you pick, right? Mm-hmm. Because it's just because you're manufacturing in one area, you can have a good supplier and you can have a bad supplier. And I think that's really where your, kind of vetting process of the supplier and also building a really close relationship with that supplier is incredibly important. And certainly for us has been something where not being able to travel in the way that we could previously, we've had to really focus on how do we build those relationships virtually and how do we make sure we're really still maintaining, production quality. I think a big mistake we made in the early days was honestly being really naive and seeing products in the sampling process and thinking that production would magically fix the issues. Yeah. And so I think, we've since then become very stringent on the stage gate processes and what kind of quality must this product satisfy in order to actually be put into mass production.
Yeah, and I think that, good partners present themselves in all ways, shapes, and forms, and crappy ones you usually know it pretty early too. Oh. And I think that for us has been like really telling. Like I feel like almost inevitably every single time that we've like tried to get someone to work with us that may be like at the next rung and they're like begrudgingly doing it, it winds up blowing up in our face. And we always try to find kind of like a sweet spot of someone who's like established but wants to grow their business and wants to grow with us, has yielded the best results for us. But it's relationships more like anything else, I think.
It's humans.
Yeah, always.
It's literally.
It's human beings all the time.
Suze, you briefly touched on working capital. So how does that interplay with like the supply chain unpredictability?
Yeah, I mean, obviously we are clients of Settle. So for us, I'd say, we have a pretty diverse capital structure. We've raised pretty significant equity funding. We have a pretty significant debt line available to us. But for us, that's really focused on using that for acquisitions themselves. And so really it's more of these flexible financing solutions like Settle that we are heavily leaning in on as we think about honestly just stocking up on our inventory position, and Settle's been a bit of a godsend for us in that respect. We also have an SVB Innovators Card and have found that really useful. I think prior to having some of these more alternative financing solutions, we were really relying on lines of credit and kind of term loans, et cetera. And honestly, it wasn't allowing us to be as nimble and agile in our approach. And it wasn't that cost effective either. I think the other thing for us, though, has been really making sure we've negotiated, quite frankly, like in a really firm way with our suppliers about payment terms and trying to really say, how do we work together here to really minimize that kind of cash to cash timing? Because it has been something that honestly I've gulped a little bit and said this is a leap of faith if I'm buying into Q1, Q2 of next year across X number of brands. That's a substantive investment that I'm having to really commit to.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean we've certainly experienced. I mean it's a lot of Band-Aids and bubble gum. I think early on to kind of holding the ship together, but. I think what we certainly have experienced, if you sort of believe the earlier rant of like these strong digital brands that are going to be leaning into retail relationships, and then the retailers now I think have access, somewhat have access to cooler brands. So they're taking even bigger and bigger swings, and brands are, instead of using it as a test, are actually looking to these partners as an opportunity for growth. So like, what does that actually mean? It means like, instead of people historically launching into 50 Sephora doors and then going to 100 the next set and going into 200 the next set and then 400, and you can sort of manage up your cash flows, they're taking 900 door swings or 1,800 or 6,000 door swings, which leaves brands, I think, in a awesome but really precarious spot where you're laying out for that inventory. You don't necessarily have access to ABLs or things like that because you have either zero history or not enough history within a retailer. So you're kind of trying to piece it together from a multitude of angles, and then you're waiting, and then you're holding your breath, and you hope that you have the velocity necessary to sustain the business. And look, we've been on the winning end of that, and we've been on the losing end of that. And I think we're comfortable with that type of approach because we're kind of gunslingers in that way, but it's not. It is certainly not for the faint of heart to take sort of that type of structure and that type of approach. But that's why we certainly have seen that the capital markets have not necessarily advanced fast enough, like at the rate of just like how business is actually being conducted today, which leaves, I think, entrepreneurs in challenging situations from debt, from equity, just sort of trying to make it all work so you don't wind up
Piecemeal it
totally
together.
upside down. Yeah, which is hard.
I mean, I think for us, it's also interesting of, one of the challenges that people who sell to us, the entrepreneurs that sell to us have faced often is thinking about their capital structure, not having access to capital in order to actually really be able to pursue those growth opportunities. And I think, that's obviously an advantage that we bring, but it's a very real concern for people, in growing their businesses. And I think while, equity capital is something that obviously, you can raise. Equity is expensive and dilutive. And so really looking at how you diversify your capital structure is important, and the makeup of that for your specific business.
Totally. I like, if you look at like some of the capital markets, like the problems that we experience are not necessarily unique in that way, but like a lot of the capital alternative financing markets were like, for when like Tommy Hilfiger got upside down during holiday season, right? Like, and they're like, oh, how do we do an ABL? And I think we're definitely focused on more like masstige and mass. Like, we love that segment of the market. So if we look at a lower COG profile business like we are, like ABLs aren't super helpful, because even if you have 1 million units on hand, if your COGs are $2 or $3, it's like not very helpful from like a cash cycle perspective. So those are all sort of like unique very much to our sort of little sliver of the market. I definitely at times am like, man, I wish we sold something that was like $80 or $100.
Oh, but there's cons of that as well.
That as well, for sure. But yeah.
What's the biggest con?
I mean, just honestly, the capital that you are outlaying, it's so funny. So I have, Gear, which is our kitchen accessories line, which is like a $10 spatula for MSRP, and, do the math there for what COGS are. And then, our open spaces line, which is our home organization line. The most expensive item is our entryway rack, which is like $184 MSRP. And so it's just, when you're looking at the capital that you're outlaying for the brand, like the amount that I'm having to bleed for open spaces to buy through to, mid next year is it is a leap of faith. And I think when we really are talking about our inventory forecasting process, we are an early stage business without a lot of data necessarily behind the businesses yet, and we're growing incredibly rapidly, and we're expanding across channels. So we've had to really lean into, trying to do the best we can with consumer insights to kind of see where we think the trends are going, and kind of hope that we're guessing correctly.
Yeah. When you think about debt as working capital, is it kind of debt is debt, or does like the structure matter?
I mean, for us, I definitely think that the structure matters, and it all fits into like a bigger puzzle of how it all comes together as like a fuller picture. And it's definitely complicated. I think we have historically over index on like free flow cash that's not tied to assets, just because we have found it to be incredibly difficult to just sort of like time it perfectly and do it really well. And part of that is like what we've noticed as we work a lot with like bigger box retailers is the way that their inventory analysts sort of go through this for the most part is, they look at the low end of the market, the high end of the market of that particular product or category, and they kind of just like will throw a number right in the middle. And we found that to be like, all right, we're building our model off of something that maybe isn't perfect science, even though we're assuming it to be gospel. And then the brokers build these ladders and like, this is how much sales you're going to do and when they're going to order on a weekly basis. And we're like, okay. And then we go and, try to find a debt instrument and lay out for inventory. And then we've been off by as much as 400%. And you're like, well, shit, like now what are we supposed to do? And I remember the first time that we faced a situation like this, I called a friend of a friend, a guy named Brad Murray, who's the founder of Tacho. And I was like, tell me that there's a better way of doing this. Like, I feel like we're idiots, right? Like we're like trying to get a little bit of debt from here and augmenting it with maybe a little bit of equity and piecing it together. He's like, now we were in the same spot. like he's like, it was just like, you're trying to figure it out. And he's like, similar to you, it sounds like it's like, they were like, yeah, Sephora would owe us like, like 12, 15 million bucks. And we would just try to like, hold payroll for, I was like, oh my God, this is terrible. But I feel like there isn't a really perfect, elegant solution that we've been able to find. It does feel like a little bit of a Frankenstein.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with that. I will say picking the right debt partner though, I mean, it's like the debt structure itself, but then also really building, again, like with anything, a relationship with your debt partner, because they are in it with you. And I mean, make sure you can actually service the debt before you take it on. Make sure you really understand every little idiosyncrasy of like edge cases and all of the debt covenants and what can trip up the covenants. Because there's always some of those things that are like, oh, it's such an outlier, but like the outliers happen. And then also make sure you have that really open dialogue with your debt partner, because ultimately, I think two of the most important things that you can do are pick really great investors, but also pick a really great debt partner who is a partner, to you in this and can help strategize and scale with you as your business, continues to evolve.
Yeah, I think that's definitely a great statement. And maybe some people on the stage, maybe not, have been on the receiving end of uncomfortable asks from us. And I think that's always the sort of human element of this is like, there's like the structure and then there's like the reality of early stage businesses, which are, I'm going to use the word violent. Like it's not normal to experience the type of growth or to take the types of risks that I think that we all take. And you can't paper everything. So it usually always winds up going down to like conversations and communication and long-term, building towards long-term
and rip the Band-Aid off. I feel like when you're avoiding the hard conversation, just do it, because it's going to happen at one point or another. And you've just got to kind of get up front there and try and then work together on how to resolve.
Yeah, and I think that's like one of the cool parts, I think certainly about our approaches, is like you're really building, I think like trying to build long-term partnerships with people, recognizing that like you're going to win some, you're going to lose some, and certain things are going to go better than expected and worse than expected. And I think that sort of is a cool approach, because you get to not necessarily have to myopically focus on this one thing that's happening at this one moment, because there's more of a breadth of a approach.
And I feel like, being an entrepreneur, I think as everyone probably knows in this room, it's not for the faint-hearted, and it's certainly not for the faint-hearted in the current operating environment that we're in, with, the supply chain being the state that it is, iOS being where it is. It's something where I think you're preparing yourself for a journey and building the business is equal parts art and science. And you've got to kind of trust that there is just an art to this, and part of this is intuition.
All right, last question. Biggest thing you learned last 2 years? What can you impart?
I think, for us, it's really been about progress, not perfection. We came from an agency background, and in an agency background, you're getting paid to be perfect. And so that's been something that we, being in an operating company, had to learn. The product has to be perfect, but the process itself is going to be a little messy and crazy and chaotic, and that's okay. And so, we've really said, let's be really clear on our end goal, but really flexible in how we get there. And sometimes making a decision in the moment with the data you have versus kind of belaboring it. Like, what's most important is just to make the decision and a game time kind of call and live with it. And I think that's been, a learning for us, and certainly one that we keep on reminding ourselves of each day as we go through this.
That's great.
Yeah, I think mine would be like, don't be afraid to like really apply the learnings that you've experienced when things don't go well. Like, I think we've tried our best to create a culture of like learning really quickly and very honestly and openly, and then immediately trying to apply that in a different way, which leads us into crazy categories and different things. But I think that is one of the challenges of being an entrepreneur, is like recognizing when you're wrong and being willing to like change course or change behavior. And I think it's something that certainly we all had to do a lot of over the last couple of years.
I'd say last thought on that as well is also being vulnerable and transparent with your team when there are mistakes or things that are not going wrong. People are smart. They can sense when things are kind of not going the way you want them to be. And ultimately, at this early stage, I feel like teams are joining you because they believe in you and your vision. And so something we've really focused on is being really vulnerable and saying to the team, we don't know yet, but here's what we do know, and here's how we're figuring it out, and kind of working through it together. And that's, again, been, a big learning, I think, about how to build culture in a remote first environment with the world kind of falling apart around you.
Yeah.
Well said.
Cool. Well, thanks so much. Round of applause for our speakers.
Thank you so much, Alek and our panelists.